My name is Walter, and just last week, in the living room of the house I built with my own 2 hands, my son called me a useless old man. He spat the words out like they were poison, and maybe they were, because I felt something wither inside me right then and there. It's a strange thing, to have the person you sacrificed everything for look at you like you're nothing more than a piece of worn-out furniture he can't wait to throw away. A lifetime of work, of love, of scraped knuckles and long nights, all of it erased in a single, ugly moment. What would you do in my place? Listen to my story until the end and tell me, what would you have done? And please, let me know from which city you're listening from. I just need to know I'm not the only one feeling this way. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. It all started when he and his wife Brenda showed up unannounced. They said they were just checking in on me. But I've been around long enough to know the smell of a favor waiting to be asked. They sat on the floral couch, Helen, my late wife, picked out 30 years ago, looking around the room with a kind of polite disgust, like they were visiting a museum of forgotten things. Kevin fidgeted with his expensive phone while Brenda surveyed my old family photos on the mantelpiece with a tight, thin smile. The air was thick with their impatience. They weren't here for me. They were here for what they thought I had, and the silence was just the runway before their demand took flight. I could feel the familiar weight of disappointment settling in my bones even before a single word about money was spoken. Finally, after some hollow small talk about their jobs and a vacation they couldn't afford, Kevin got to the point. He wanted a down payment for a new luxury SUV. He said it so casually, as if he were asking to borrow a screwdriver. He mentioned a number that made my breath catch in my throat, more money than I see in a year from my Social Security. I looked at him, at this man I raised, who has a business degree I paid for by working double shifts and selling off the small plot of land my own father left me. I told him, calmly, that I couldn't. I explained that my income was fixed, that after bills and property taxes on this old house, there wasn't much left. I suggested they look at their own finances, maybe cut back on a few things. It wasn't a lecture. It was just the plain, simple truth from a father to his son. That's when the dam broke. Kevin's face turned a dark, blotchy red. Brenda just sat there, her expression a mix of scorn and encouragement, silently urging him on. He shot up from the couch, his voice ringing with a frustration that had clearly been building for years. He pointed a trembling finger not at me, but at the door leading to my backyard workshop. "Always with your excuses and your old junk," he yelled, his voice cracking. "That workshop is a pile of scrap metal and worth nothing, just like you. Stop being a burden and give us what we're asking for, you useless old man." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy like shards of glass. He didn't just want my money. He wanted to tear down every last piece of my life that he didn't value, which, I was beginning to realize, was all of it. I didn't yell back. I didn't even look him in the eye. All the fight just drained out of me, replaced by a cold, heavy calm. I was holding an old wrench I'd been using to fix the leaky faucet under the sink, its familiar weight cool in my palm. My knuckles were white, but my face was blank. I looked down at my hands, stained with a lifetime of grease and work. The same hands that had changed his diapers, built his childhood swing set, and signed the tuition checks for his future. Without a word, I turned my back on him and Brenda. I walked slowly to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped into my workshop. I closed the door behind me and turned the deadbolt. The solid click of the lock was the only answer I gave him. In the sudden silence, surrounded by my tools and my memories, I knew something had ended forever, and something else had just begun. Inside this workshop, the air smells of old oil, sawdust, and a lifetime of patience. It's funny, my son sees this place as a pile of junk, but to me, every tool on these walls tells a story. This hammer built his crib. That lathe shaped the legs of the dining table where he learned to eat solid food. He called me useless, but everything useful in his early life came from these 2 hands and this very room. I ran here after his words hit me, and now, surrounded by the ghosts of my labor, I can't help but trace the long, winding road that led me to this moment, to being locked away from my own son in the sanctuary I built for my family. The cold steel of the deadbolt feels less like a barrier and more like the final punctuation on a story I thought I understood. I wasn't born to much. My life started on a small farm in rural Pennsylvania, where the days were measured by the sun and the seasons, not by a clock on the wall. I was pulling my weight by the time I was 14, my hands already calloused and strong from mending fences and hauling feed. My father wasn't a man of many words, but he taught me that your worth was in what you could build, fix, or grow. He'd look at a broken piece of machinery, tilt his head, and say, "Everything has a purpose, Walter. You just have to find it." I guess I took that to heart. I learned to see the potential in things others threw away, to find the hidden strength in what looked weak or worn out. It was a good lesson, one that served me well for most of my life. The farm couldn't hold me forever, though. In the 60s, the whole world seemed to be humming with a different kind of energy, and I felt the pull of it. I packed a single bag and bought a bus ticket to Pittsburgh. The city was a shock to the system, a roaring, smoking giant of steel and ambition. It was loud and dirty and more alive than anything I'd ever known. I found work in construction, swinging a hammer on high-rise skeletons that clawed at the sky. It was brutal work, but it was honest. For the first time, I was earning a real wage, sending a little back home, and saving the rest. I was building a city, but I was also trying to build a future for myself, brick by hard-earned brick. It was in Pittsburgh that I met Helen. She worked at a diner near one of the construction sites, a place where tired men like me would go for a hot meal and a moment of peace. She had a smile that could cut through the thickest layer of soot and exhaustion. I was just another guy in dusty work boots, but she looked at me differently. She saw past the grime. She'd ask me about my day, not just what I was building, but what I dreamed of building. She was the first person who ever made me feel like my thoughts were as important as the work of my hands. She wasn't just the love of my life. She was the architect of it. She gave my ambition a blueprint. With Helen by my side, I felt like I could do anything. I moved from construction into a job as an industrial mechanic at one of the big plants. The work was more intricate, more challenging. It was a world of gears and pistons, of complex systems that had to work in perfect harmony. I loved it. I spent my days troubleshooting, repairing, and making things run better. I learned the language of machines, the subtle groans and whirs that told you something was wrong. My hands were always stained with grease, a fact that would later seem to embarrass my son, but back then, that grease was a badge of honor. It was the sign of a man who provided, who understood how the world worked from the inside out. We saved every penny we could. After a few years, we had enough for a small plot of land in a quiet suburb, a place where you could still see the stars at night. I didn't hire a contractor to build our house. I built it myself, with the help of a few friends from the plant on weekends. I poured the foundation, framed the walls, and laid every single shingle on the roof. I remember Helen, pregnant with Kevin, bringing me lemonade as I worked under the hot summer sun. She planted a small garden in the front yard before the walls were even up. "A home needs roots," she said. We were literally putting our roots down, creating a foundation not just of concrete, but of shared effort and love. Once the house was finished, the first thing I built was the workshop in the back. It started as a simple shed, but over the years, it grew. It became my haven. While other men had a den with a television, I had my workbench, my tools, and my ideas. Helen understood. She never complained about the time I spent out here. In fact, she encouraged it. She'd bring me a cup of coffee and sit on a stool, just watching me tinker. She called it my thinking palace. It was more than just a place to fix things. It was where I worked on my own inventions, little designs for parts and tools that I thought could make things work just a little bit better. It was my space, ours in a way, filled with quiet dreams. Then Kevin was born, and my world shifted on its axis. Holding that tiny baby in my arms, I felt a weight of responsibility so profound it almost scared me. This wasn't about building houses or fixing machines anymore. This was about building a life for another human being. I looked at my calloused hands and at his perfect, tiny fingers, and I made a silent promise to him, and to Helen. I promised that he would have opportunities I never did. He would have an education. He would have choices. He would never have to know the bone-deep weariness of manual labor unless he chose it. My sacrifice would be his foundation. That promise cost us. When it was time for Kevin to go to college, we didn't have nearly enough saved. He'd been accepted to a good business school, and the tuition was staggering. Helen and I talked it over late one night at the kitchen table. We didn't have to say much. The next day, I put the small plot of land my father had left me up for sale. It was the last piece of my old life, my only real inheritance. I sold it without a second thought. Watching Kevin walk across that graduation stage, diploma in hand, I felt a pride that made the sacrifice feel like nothing. I thought I was handing him the keys to the world. I believed I was investing in his future, in his happiness. I remember when he was about 10, he wanted a go-kart more than anything. We couldn't afford one from the store, so I told him we'd build one. We spent a whole summer out here in the workshop, me teaching him how to use the tools safely, him drawing up blueprints on notebook paper. We used an old lawnmower engine and scrap metal I'd collected. I'll never forget the look on his face the first time he got it running, the sheer, unadulterated joy as he zoomed around the backyard. In that moment, this workshop wasn't a dirty, dangerous place. It was a magical factory where his dreams came true. We were a team. I wonder if he remembers that. Helen's sickness came on slowly, then all at once. It started with a tiredness she couldn't shake, and ended in a sterile white hospital room that smelled of antiseptic. The vibrant woman I knew faded, but her spirit never broke. I spent every moment I could by her side, holding her hand, telling her stories about our life, about the house, about Kevin. The workshop fell silent during those years. The only thing I worked on was keeping our hope alive. She was the one who was brave. She worried more about me and Kevin than she did about herself. Her strength in the face of it all was the most incredible and most painful thing I have ever witnessed. On one of her last good days, she made me promise 2 things. Her voice was a whisper, but her eyes were clear and steady. "Promise me you'll finish our project, Walter," she said, referring to the special bearing design we'd joked about for years, our little secret. "It's a good idea. Don't let it die with me." Then she squeezed my hand tighter. "And promise me you'll look after Kevin. He's a good boy, but he doesn't always see the value in things you can't buy." I promised. I promised her both things, my throat tight with a grief I couldn't show. I thought I understood what she meant. I thought looking after him meant making sure he was safe and secure. I see now she might have meant something else entirely. After she was gone, the house felt cavernous and cold. The silence was a physical thing, a weight in every room. The workshop became my refuge more than ever. I'd come out here and just sit, surrounded by the smell of her favorite wood polish that I still used on the workbench. Her picture is still here, right next to my vise, a photo from a picnic we had years ago, her head thrown back in laughter. I started working on our project in earnest, pouring all my grief and my love for her into the precise calculations and meticulous drawings. It was my way of keeping my promise, of keeping her with me. It was the only conversation I had left. Kevin's change was subtle at first. He met Brenda, a woman who seemed to measure the world in price tags and brand names. When they'd visit, I could see Kevin looking at our home through her eyes. The floral couch Helen had loved was now dated. My work clothes were messy. He started introducing me as retired instead of as a mechanic, as if the work I'd done my whole life was something to be glossed over. He grew ashamed of the grease under my fingernails, the very same grease that had paid for his business degree and his clean, soft hands. He was trying to erase his own history, and in doing so he was erasing me. The distance grew into a chasm. They stopped inviting me for holidays, saying it was too much for me to travel, even though they lived 40 minutes away. On the rare occasions I saw my grandchildren, Brenda would steer them away from the workshop, calling it a dangerous pile of junk. She was building a wall between me and the only family I had left, and Kevin just stood by and handed her the bricks. I became an obligation, a box to be checked off once a month with a brief, sterile phone call. I went from being a father to being a footnote in my own son's life. The loneliness was a quiet, constant ache. And so, when he stood in my living room and those words, "useless old man," came out of his mouth, it wasn't just an insult born of momentary anger. It was the culmination of years of quiet dismissals, of being made to feel invisible and obsolete. He was looking at me, at the house I built, at the workshop that held the memory of his mother and the proof of my life's work, and all he could see was a burden. He saw nothing of value. As I sit here tonight, the click of that deadbolt echoes in my mind. I kept my promise to Helen. I finished our project. But my other promise, to look after Kevin, I realize now it doesn't mean protecting him from the world. It means making him finally face the value of things he was never able to see. The change wasn't like a switch being flipped. It was more like a slow, creeping rust. It started right after Kevin married Brenda. She came into our lives with a smile that never quite reached her eyes and a way of looking at things. My home, my clothes, my hands, as if she were calculating their resale value and finding it wanting. In the beginning, Kevin would try to bridge the gap. He'd say, "Brenda's just not used to this, Dad. She grew up differently." He was making excuses for her, But what he was really doing was building the first few bricks in a wall between us. A wall I was too proud, or maybe too naive, to see was being built. I thought love was stronger than bricks. I was wrong. I see that now, sitting here in the quiet of my shop. The first time I truly felt it, the shift from being the patriarch to being a piece of furniture, was on a Sunday afternoon. Brenda was walking through the living room, the one Helen and I had decorated with so much care, and she paused in front of the bookshelf. "All these old books," she said, not to me, but to the room. "So dusty. We should get Kevin a Kindle for his birthday." It was a small comment, but it landed like a stone in a quiet pond. She wasn't just talking about books. She was passing judgment on a whole way of life. The worst part was Kevin, standing by the doorway, just nodding slightly. He didn't defend the books his mother loved, the stories he grew up with. In his silence, I heard an agreement. My world was being declared obsolete. Their conversations began to change too. When they visited, they spoke a language I didn't understand, a dialect of brand names, investment portfolios, and talk of trips to places I'd only ever seen in magazines. They would sit on Helen's couch, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones, and discuss their 5-year plan. I would enter the room with a cup of coffee, and the conversation would just stop. They'd look up, offer me a tight smile, and then fall into a silence that was louder than any argument. It was their way of telling me that their world had no room for me, that my experiences and my wisdom were no longer a valid currency in the economy of their modern lives. I was a foreigner in the house I had built with my own 2 hands. I'll never forget the day Kevin first looked ashamed of me. I'd been in the workshop all afternoon, wrestling with a stubborn engine part, and my hands were coated in a familiar layer of grease and oil. I came inside for a glass of water, and Brenda was there with some of her friends, women with immaculate nails and expensive purses. I said hello, and as I reached for a glass, I left a slight smudge on the cabinet door. Brenda's eyes darted to the smudge, then to my hands, and her face tightened with a barely concealed disgust. But it was Kevin's reaction that broke a piece of my heart. He quickly grabbed a paper towel, wiped the smudge, and then pushed the towel into my hand, refusing to meet my eyes. He wasn't just cleaning a cabinet, he was trying to wipe away the evidence of where he came from. My 75th birthday was the turning point. For years, Helen had made it a huge celebration. After she passed, Kevin and I kept the tradition alive, a small steak dinner, maybe a cake. But that year, the phone call came a week before. "Dad," Kevin said, his voice strained with false concern. "Brenda and I were thinking, you're not really up for a big fuss anymore, are you? It's probably too much for you." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. I told him it was fine, that I understood. But on the night of my birthday, I sat alone in my kitchen, the silence of the empty house pressing in on me. I had bought a small cupcake from the grocery store and put a single candle in it. As I blew it out, I didn't make a wish. I just acknowledged a cold, hard truth. I was an inconvenience, an obligation they were looking for ways to avoid. The worst part of the growing distance was what it did to my relationship with my grandchildren, Tommy and Lisa. When they were little, this workshop was their favorite place in the world. They'd run in, their eyes wide with wonder, and ask, "Grandpa, what are we building today?" I taught Tommy how to hold a hammer, how to sand a piece of wood until it was smooth as glass. I built Lisa a dollhouse that was an exact replica of our home. We were partners in creation. Those were the days I felt my life had the most meaning, passing on the joy of making something real and tangible. I saw the best parts of myself and of Helen reflected in their bright, curious eyes. It was a connection I thought was unbreakable. Then Brenda put her foot down. One Saturday, the kids came over and made a beeline for the backyard, heading for the workshop as usual. I heard Brenda's sharp voice cut through the air. "No, you two. You are not going in there. It's dirty and full of dangerous, rusty junk." I was standing in the doorway and saw the confusion on their faces, the disappointment. Tommy looked at me, his expression asking for help, for me to overrule her. I looked at Kevin, expecting him to step in, to defend the place where he himself had built a go-kart with me. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, and said, "She's right, kids. Listen to your mother." He chose her, and in that choice, he severed a bond that had spanned 3 generations. The workshop door felt a lot heavier after that. From that day on, my time with them was supervised, sanitized, They weren't allowed to get their clothes dirty. They weren't allowed to touch my tools. Our visits were relegated to the living room, where they'd sit politely on the couch, fidgeting with tablets Brenda had provided. The natural, easy joy was gone, replaced by a strained formality. Brenda was systematically teaching them that their grandfather's world was something to be avoided, something lesser than. She was poisoning the well, and Kevin was letting her. I was no longer the grandpa who could build anything. I was just an old man in an old house that they had to visit out of a sense of duty. The light in their eyes when they looked at me started to dim. Family dinners became a masterclass in humiliation. It was a slow, subtle demotion. For decades, I sat at the head of the table. It was my home, my table. But then, they started placing me there as if it were a ceremonial position with no actual authority. The real center of gravity shifted to wherever Kevin and Brenda were sitting. They would talk across me, their conversations, a flurry of phone notifications and inside jokes. I would try to join in, maybe tell a story about the neighborhood when it was all fields, and Brenda would give a polite, dismissive smile before turning back to her phone. I became a ghost at my own table, a silent observer of a family that was moving on without me. I remember one Thanksgiving vividly. The whole family was there, and I was trying to connect with my grandson, Tommy. I started telling him about the first engine I ever rebuilt, how it felt to bring something so complex back to life. He was actually listening, his eyes lit with interest. Then Brenda swooped in. "Tommy, honey, don't let your grandpa bore you with his old stories. Why don't you show everyone that new app on your iPad?" Just like that, the moment was shattered. My story was dismissed as boring, my life's work reduced to an old man's rambling. Kevin saw the whole thing, saw the flicker of hurt in my eyes, and he just carved the turkey, acting like nothing had happened. It was a clear message. My history was not welcome here. Brenda's influence grew more potent over time. I started overhearing snippets of conversations not meant for my ears. Her voice, sharp and insistent, drifting from the other room. "This house is a money pit, Kevin. We're pouring money into his life that we should be investing in ours." One evening, I heard the word she used to describe me to him, an anchor. She said I was an anchor, holding them back from the life they deserved. I stood in the hallway, my hand on the wall to steady myself, and I felt the weight of that word. An anchor is supposed to provide stability and safety. But she had twisted it into something heavy, something that drags you down to the bottom of the sea. Kevin, bless his heart, used to be a good boy, but he was weak. He absorbed her worldview like a sponge. He began to parrot her opinions, presenting them as his own practical concerns. "Dad, Brenda has a point," he'd say, starting a sentence that I knew would end with some suggestion about selling the house or moving me into a more manageable apartment. He was no longer just a bystander to my erasure. He had become an active agent in it. The son I had sacrificed everything for was now calculating my worth in square footage and property taxes, and he was coming to the conclusion that I was a liability on his balance sheet. The holidays lost all their warmth. They became transactions. The gifts they'd bring were always sterile and impersonal. A beige sweater 2 sizes too big, a gift certificate for a chain restaurant. It was clear they were bought out of obligation, a box checked on a to-do list. I would thank them, my voice hollow, and hand them the gifts I'd spent weeks on, a hand-carved box for Brenda, a custom-made tool for Kevin's garage. They would thank me with the same polite enthusiasm they'd show a stranger, setting my gifts aside without a second look. The love and thought I poured into them had become invisible, just like the man who had made them. I would sit in my armchair by the fire after they left on Christmas Eve, and the house would feel impossibly empty. My mind would drift back to the Christmases when Helen was alive. The air would have been thick with the smell of pine needles and her famous apple pie. The sound of Kevin's laughter would have echoed through the halls. We didn't have much money back then, but we were rich in a way Kevin and Brenda would never understand. Now the house was just a cold, quiet shell, filled with the ghosts of a happiness that felt 1,000,000 miles away. The contrast was a physical pain, a sharp ache in my chest that had nothing to do with old age. There was a flicker of false hope about a year ago. Kevin called me in a panic, his voice sounding just like it did when he was a teenager. The main water pipe in his basement had burst. For 20 minutes I felt like a father again. I was the expert, the one with the answers. I calmly walked him through how to shut off the main, how to patch the pipe temporarily, which plumber to call who wouldn't rip him off. He thanked me, sounding genuinely grateful. For a day, I felt useful again. Then I found out from a neighbor that he had called an emergency plumber before he even called me. He was just placating me, making the old man feel involved before turning to a real professional. The sting of that realization was worse than any open insult. My invisibility became absolute. I was a presence they had learned to look through. They would stand in my kitchen and discuss my future as if I were a problem to be managed. "If we sell, the market is high right now," Brenda would say to Kevin, her eyes scanning the room, assessing its value. "We could put him in that nice assisted living place over by the mall. He'd have company." They weren't talking to me. They were talking about me, about him. I had been demoted from Dad and Grandpa to a third-person pronoun, an object to be moved and managed for their convenience. The final straw, the moment that set the stage for the ugly confrontation in my living room, happened a month before he called me useless. It was their anniversary, and they were having a small dinner party. They invited me, which was a surprise. During dessert, Kevin stood up to make a toast. He announced they were planning a lavish trip to Europe, a second honeymoon. "It's expensive," he said with a laugh, looking at Brenda, "but you only live once. We're just hoping to free up some capital soon to make it happen." He glanced at me for a fraction of a second, and in that glance, I saw everything. I wasn't a guest at their celebration. I was the capital. My home, my life, my legacy. It was the thing they needed to free up. Sitting there, surrounded by their laughing friends, I finally understood. The slow fade was over. I had become, in their eyes, a simple and frustrating math problem. I was the one variable standing between them and the life they felt they were owed. The love, the respect, the shared history. It had all been stripped away, layer by painful layer, until all that was left was their impatience and my perceived obsolescence. The foundation for my son's cruelty wasn't laid in a moment of anger. It was built slowly, over years, with every missed birthday, every dismissed story, every look of shame, and every whispered conversation about how much easier their lives would be if I were simply gone. My son sees this workshop as a mausoleum, a dusty tomb filled with the bones of my obsolete life. He looks at the lathes, the drill presses, the organized chaos of my tools, and sees only rust and failure. He has no idea that this room, the one he dismissed so easily, is not a graveyard. It's an armory. He thinks he won the battle in the living room with his cruel words, but he doesn't realize the war was decided in here years ago, on terms he could never possibly comprehend. As I sit on my worn wooden stool, the silence isn't one of defeat. It's the quiet hum of a machine powering up for its final, most important task. This secret I've kept, it began as a promise to Helen. On one of her last coherent days, her hand felt so frail in mine she looked past me, toward the window that faced this workshop. "Don't let them waste it, Walter," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. "Kevin's a good boy, but he's got a hole in him that money can't fill. Brenda will just keep pouring it in." She knew. She saw the weakness in him long before I was willing to admit it. My promise wasn't just to finish our project. It was to protect it from the very people I thought I was building it for. The secret was never about hiding wealth. It was about preserving meaning. The project itself sounds simple when you say it out loud. A high-efficiency, self-lubricating bearing for heavy industrial machinery. But simple ideas are the hardest to perfect. It wasn't born from a single flash of genius. It was born from 20 years of tired eyes and greasy hands, of countless nights spent out here after a full shift at the plant. It was 1,000 tiny failures, 100 small breakthroughs, countless sketches on greasy napkins that I'd bring in for Helen to look at. It was the slow, patient, grinding work of a man obsessed with making something work just a little bit better. It was my life's real work, hidden in plain sight. The idea came from the constant breakdowns I saw at the plant. A single seized bearing could shut down a whole production line, costing the company thousands. I watched men sweat and curse, trying to force grease into impossible angles. I just knew there had to be a smarter way. The problem became a puzzle in my mind, a knot I had to untie. Helen encouraged it. She'd bring me coffee and call this workshop our secret laboratory. She called the bearing our nest egg, a little dream we were building together, a testament to the idea that a working man's mind was his most valuable tool. My son and his wife look at me and see an old man who fumbles with a smartphone, a relic from a bygone era. They see the calluses on my hands and assume my mind is just as rough and unrefined. They never once in all these years walked in here and asked, "Dad, what are you actually working on?" They saw the tools, but they never saw the meticulous blueprints locked in my drafting table. They saw the metal shavings on the floor, but they never saw the complex physics and material science calculations in my notebooks. They underestimated my intellect because they were ashamed of the labor that shaped me. So I kept the secret. In the beginning, it was to honor Helen. It was our private world, our shared language. To tell Kevin about it would have been like translating a love poem into a stock market report. He would have immediately seen dollar signs, not the years of our life invested in it. He wouldn't have understood the beauty of a perfectly balanced mechanism, or the quiet triumph of solving a problem no one else could. He would have just asked, "How much is it worth?" And that question would have broken the spell, and my heart along with it. The breakthrough came about 3 years ago, on a quiet Tuesday night. I had been experimenting with a new composite alloy for the casing. After machining the final prototype, I fitted it into my test rig. I flipped the switch, and instead of the usual groan and grind, there was just a smooth, almost silent whir. It worked. It worked better than I had ever dreamed. I remember picking it up. It was cool and heavy in my palm, a small, perfect piece of steel and polymer that held 2 decades of my life. I looked at Helen's picture on the workbench and whispered, "We did it, honey. We finally did it." That moment changed everything. It was no longer just a personal project. I knew I had something real, something valuable. I called my old friend Art Donovan, a patent attorney I had known for years. He used to be a young engineer at the plant, and I'd helped him out of a few jams. He came over, I showed him the prototype and my data. He just stared at it for a long time, turning it over and over in his hands. Then he looked at me and said, "Walter, do you have any idea what you've done? This isn't just clever. This is a game changer." He took on the case right then and there, quietly and without any fuss. A year later, the official document arrived in the mail, a thick manila envelope from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Inside was a certificate, embossed and official, for U.S. Patent number 78B45. I held it in my hands, the same hands my son found so embarrassing, and I felt a sense of validation that no paycheck had ever given me. This was proof. It was tangible evidence that the useless old man, with his pile of junk, had created something new, something the world had never seen before. I put it in my old steel toolbox, right next to Helen's photo. Art was good to his word. He knew the right people to talk to, the kind of people who understood what they were looking at. He discreetly shopped the patent around to a few major players in the industrial sector. The interest was immediate. Engineers from a huge international corporation flew in. They spent 2 days in my workshop, this worthless workshop, running tests, poring over my data, their faces a mixture of disbelief and excitement. They treated this space not like a junkyard, but like a holy site. They treated me not like a burden, but like an innovator. Last month, they made their formal offer. It wasn't for a down payment on an SUV. It wasn't for a few $1,000s to ease my burden. The final, legally binding offer to purchase the rights to U.S. Patent number 78B45 was for $5 million. I had Art write the number down for me on a shop rag, just so I could see it. $5 million. It looked like a typo. It was a number that belonged to a different world, a world of men in suits like my son. And it had come from here, from the grease and the noise and the love I had poured into these 4 walls. The irony is so thick I can barely breathe it. Kevin stood in my living room, his face twisted in contempt, demanding a fraction of that amount. He was begging for scraps from a table he didn't even know was piled high with a feast. He and Brenda were so blinded by their petty, short-sighted greed that they couldn't see the real treasure. They looked right at the source of a life-changing fortune and called it a pile of junk. They called the man who created it useless. Their arrogance was, and is, truly spectacular. And that's when everything shifted inside me. As I sat here in the workshop, the echo of his insults still ringing in my ears, the deep, hollow pain began to recede. It was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I finally understood the second part of my promise to Helen. "Look after Kevin," she had said. For 10 years I thought that meant protecting him, providing for him, making his life easy. I was wrong. Looking after him meant letting him finally face the consequences of his own character. It meant teaching him the one lesson he had so spectacularly failed to learn. His words, "useless old man," were not an insult. They were a release. They were a gift. They severed the final thread of my misplaced paternal obligation. He had made it unequivocally clear that he didn't see me as a father, a grandfather, or even a man. He saw me as an obstacle, a line item on his budget that he wanted to erase. He had drawn his line in the sand. And now, with the quiet calm of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect, it was my turn to draw mine. The greatest skill I ever learned in this workshop wasn't welding or machining, it was patience. I learned that you can't force a piece of metal to bend to your will. You have to understand its nature, heat it, and guide it. You can't fix a complex engine by banging on it with a hammer. You have to listen, diagnose the root problem, and address it with precision. My son's problem was never a lack of money. It was a poverty of the soul. And a man like that cannot be fixed with an inheritance. He can only be fixed with a mirror. And so, the secret has a new destiny. The $5 million will no longer be a nest egg for my son's unearned comfort. It will become a legacy of a different sort. It will be a foundation built not on the accident of birth, but on the virtues of ingenuity and hard work. A legacy that will honor the woman who believed in me, my Helen. The plan began to form in my mind, piece by perfect piece, like one of my designs. It was not a plan born of revenge. It was a plan born of justice. My workshop was about to create its final, most meaningful invention. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat here on this stool, the smell of oil and old wood filling my lungs, and I thought. I thought about Helen, about the promises I made, and about the son I raised. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the workshop window, the pain in my chest had been replaced by something else. It was a cold, hard certainty. His words hadn't broken me. They had liberated me. He called me useless, but he had just given my life its final, most important purpose. I picked up the phone, my fingers steady, and called Art Donovan. I didn't have to think about what I was going to say. The plan was already fully formed in my mind, as clear and precise as any blueprint I had ever drawn. When Art answered, his voice groggy with sleep, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Art, it's Walter. I need you to draw up a new will for me today." I could hear him sit up in his bed. I laid it out for him, simple and direct. First, the house. I told him to put it on the market immediately. I was done being a landlord to ghosts and a groundskeeper for my son's expectations. Then, I told him about the inheritance. To my son Kevin, I would leave my workshop, just the workshop. "And I want this exact wording in the will, Art," I said, my voice as level as a freshly planed board. To my son Kevin, I leave my workshop and everything inside it, all the tools, the machinery, and the scrap, hoping he might finally find within its walls the value of work he never learned to appreciate. Then I told him about the money, all of it. The $5 million from the sale of U.S. patent number 78B45 was to be placed in a trust. It would be the seed money for a new organization, the Helen Miller Foundation for Young Inventors. The name felt right the moment I said it. The foundation's purpose would be to give scholarships to kids from working-class families, kids who had a knack for mechanics and engineering but didn't have the means to pursue it. It would be for the kids who saw a pile of junk and dreamed of what it could become. The money wouldn't be squandered on a luxury SUV or a trip to Europe. It would build futures. It would be a legacy of creation, not consumption. It would be a monument to Helen's faith in me. Art drew up the papers that same day. I signed them in his office, my signature firm and clear. A week later, a for sale sign went up in the front yard of the house I built. Kevin and Brenda drove by that evening. I saw their car slow down, the brake lights glowing red in the dusk. They didn't stop. They didn't call. I imagine they thought I'd finally cracked, that the old man was selling off his only asset out of desperation. I felt a strange sense of peace watching them drive away. They had no idea. They saw a defeat, a surrender. I knew it was a declaration of independence. The silence from their end was the most honest communication we'd had in years. I live in a small apartment now, a few towns over. It's clean and quiet, with a big window that lets in the morning sun. I don't have a workshop anymore, but I don't need one. My life's work is done. The money is safe, waiting to give other young dreamers the chance I made for myself. My son has his inheritance waiting for him, a building full of junk that he'll have to pay taxes on. He wanted me to stop being a burden, and in the end, I have. I've unburdened myself from his greed, and I've unburdened him from a fortune he didn't earn and wouldn't have understood. He called me a useless old man, but my worth was never in his opinion. It was in my hands, in my mind, and in the love for a woman whose memory will now build 100 new futures. And that's a value he'll never be able to calculate.